Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with Dr. John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lennox.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about your book that came out in April 2020, and this is Where is God in a Coronavirus World? My goodness, first of all, the fact that it came out a month after coronavirus was identified as a pandemic. My goodness, I'm so impressed by that. But you mentioned in your book that at times like these, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, something unprecedented in our time, that we're very vulnerable and we start to ask big questions of life. What are some of those questions, and how can we even begin to find answers in the midst of a pandemic?
The big questions that come are the obvious ones, because a pandemic, once people begin to die, reminds us that we're mortal. It reminds us that we're not in control. And it brings the death question right into the center. And you can't think for very long about death and eternity without thinking about God. And it's very evident, even in my country, that, for example, online church services have shown people have turned up 5 or 10 times the normal kind of church service, which shows that people really want to have answers to big questions. And of course, the central one is God and a pandemic. How do we cope with that kind of what is called natural evil, tsunamis, cancers, and the pandemic?
Yeah, and that really leads to my next question then. When we think about these perspectives of God or not God, how does an atheistic perspective answer these big questions, and how is that unique from the perspective that Christianity would offer and the answers to those questions?
Well, many atheists and people I know just say, well, this is evidence that there is no God, and we just have to accept it as a brute fact. That is what the universe is like. It doesn't care for us, and ultimately we are meaningless. Now, that appears to many people to solve an intellectual problem, but what I notice about it is it doesn't remove the suffering. That's the first thing. But what it does remove, self-evidently, is all hope. Now, of course, if atheism is true, we've got to face that. But the human spirit and the human heart tends to rebel against that and ask a deeper question: is there no evidence anywhere that there could be hope? And my answer as a Christian is absolutely, because, and here's where atheism cannot go. Atheism gives no hope because for it death is the end. But Christianity has at its heart the conquest of death through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that makes a huge difference. Also, Christianity has at its heart what we might call a suffering God. Jesus' central claim to be God incarnate. He was crucified, and that raises the question, what is God doing on a cross? And therefore, I feel that Christianity is something very clear to say. It doesn't take away the disease, and it doesn't take away death, but it gives people a hope that transcends death and COVID-19. And therefore, I felt it was important to write a book that tried to get these things across in a fairly short space.
Right. And you're talking about the suffering that Christ endured. And that is something that we think about in the midst of a pandemic. We think about our suffering, human suffering. And from an atheistic perspective, they might question, okay, your God suffered on your behalf, but how can we explain the suffering that humans are experiencing if God is loving? And that's kind of a common challenge. How can you?
Oh, of course. And that's the central challenge. Let's face it, the problem of evil and suffering is the hardest problem any of us face, whatever we believe. That's the first thing. And you take the point you made, if God is all powerful and he's all love. How can there be suffering? That goes back to Lucretius, Epicurus, David Hume, and so on and so forth. And what I notice is that when we've discussed that all day, all night, as many of us used to do as students, we never get a satisfactory solution. And that puzzled me for a long time until I realized as a mathematician now that we've been asking the wrong question. You're never going to resolve that. And so I put another question in its place that's equally difficult, but brings us further forward. And that other question is this: any worldview has to face what I call a mixed picture: beauty and bombs, beauty and barbed wire, beauty and a coronavirus. We got to face that. That is how it is. And any worldview that doesn't face that isn't worth thinking about it. So, granted that that is the picture, my question is there evidence anywhere that there's a God that we can trust with that? Now, that's no easy question, but that brings me back to Christ himself, for the way he lived and died and cared for people and showed his love. And yet, as we investigate that, we find that it doesn't take away the ragged edges. But if his claims are true, then his promises mean that ultimately there is a glorious place where he is, and where those that trust him will one day be, where death is no more and suffering is no more. Now, that sounds too simplistic, and I tried to go into it in a little bit more detail in the book. And by the way, I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake some years ago. And somebody has put up a website, and if your viewers Google my name and New Zealand, they'll find a whole series of talks and interviews that go into this in massive depth and at length, because I feel it is such an important question.
Right. No, definitely it is. And it's something that I hear as a challenge posed to many Christians, that problem of evil. And I love what you said about just moving us forward in that conversation. And as we grapple with this topic, we just want to move forward, even if we don't have a firm answer, yes or no. We have enough evidence to piece together something. Thank you so much for this conversation. Again, for our viewers, if you want to read more about this topic, look for Dr. John Lennox's book, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And you can find it wherever you purchase books.